Thank you for enduring our sound check. We are taping this with ATXN this evening. So thank you for attending the Imagine Austin Speaker Series, Water Forward, Planning for the Next 100 Years. We are very thrilled about the turnout and this evidence that people are engaged with planning for our Austin's water future. So thank you so much for coming out. I'm Jenny Guerrero with Austin Water in the Public Information Office, and we just have a few announcements before we get started, and then I'll let these guys have most of the time for you. We'd like to thank a few folks that helped with tonight's event. First of all, our city partners over at Imagine Austin and the Planning and Zoning Department for co-hosting this with us. We'd also like to thank the staff at the Thompson Center for use of this beautiful facility, and of course, thank our friends over at ATXN and Robert for being here tonight to record tonight's talk. It will be available shortly. We're thinking maybe a week or so. Check back with us, but it should be available online, on demand on ATXN, and then through links from our website and Imagine Austin's website. The Imagine Austin Speaker Series hosts talks presented annually by nationally known experts in the fields of land use, transportation, development, public health, the economy, the built and natural environment, social equity, and sustainability. So they cover lots of things. The City of Austin conducts these events to promote and implement the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan that was adopted by Council in 2012. The event, again, is hosted by City of Austin's Planning and Zoning Department and Austin Water. There will be a question and answer session at the end. Please jot down any questions you may have. Staff will come around to collect those throughout the talk. We have with us tonight the Water Forward project sponsor, Teresa Lutz, and the project manager, Marisa Flores Gonzalez, and they'll come around and get those cards from you and get them to the moderator so we can get those questions answered. If for some reason we don't get to your question or you have some afterwards, please email us at any time. There are several ways you can get in touch with us, and we have that on the materials. We'll have it up on the screen as well. And we appreciate any questions, comments, feedbacks, and input as we go through this planning process. Now for the main event. So you can find the complete bios on the handout that you got on the way in. I am pleased to introduce our panelists and our moderator. First, we have Greg Meszaros, and he is the director at Austin Water. Greg leads a department of staffers like me, over around 1,100 of us, and he's been doing so since 2007. We are also happy to have Sharlene Leurig, director of the Texas Environmental Flows Project, and she is also chair of the Water Forward Integrated Water Resource Planning Community Task Force, and that's quite a title. And to make sure everything keeps moving right along, we have with us our moderator, Mike Kanan. Mike is the president and CEO of the Texas Media Foundation and also the publisher of the Austin Monitor. So I believe Greg will start us off. And again, thank you so much for coming out. We appreciate your input and involvement as we begin this process.
All right. Thank you, Jenny, and welcome everyone. Good evening. A pleasure to be here again. I'm Greg Meszaros. I'm director of Austin Water. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of context to tonight's discussion about water planning, our water forward process, so you have a little bit better sense of kind of what's happening. So with some background, Austin Water is a water utility that serves most of the Austin area. We serve the city of Austin as well as areas outside the city and several smaller surrounding communities and municipal utility districts. We serve over a 548 square mile area across 3 counties, very large utility geographic span. If you drive from our southern end of our system to the northern end, it's over 50 miles. We are a large utility, over $550 million in annual revenue. And our water source is all surface water. It's all Colorado River water. Really 2 components make up the city of Austin's water supply. First, we have what are called senior run-of-river rights with surface water. The first to draw from the river has what are the oldest rights and the ability to continue to draw. Austin's rights date back well over 100 years. And in many years, in many months, all of our water supply comes through our senior run-of-river rights. However, during droughts and other dry periods when the natural flow of the river is not adequate to sustain the utility, we have worked with the Lower Colorado River Authority, or LCRA. We have a long-term relationship with them where we draw on stored water, water that's stored in the reservoirs. The reservoirs of the Colorado River system are the Highland Lakes, predominantly Lake Travis and Lake Buchanan. Lake Buchanan's at the top end of the chain. Lake Travis is the lake right here by us. And those two lakes form the storage components of the Highland Lake system. Approximately 2 million acre-feet of storage when full. If you think of 1 acre of land about a foot deep, that's an acre-foot. It's about 325,000 gallons, or about enough water for 4 Austin residential households a year. So that's what makes up our water supply. This is a picture taken a few months ago of Lake Travis. I mean, doesn't that make you feel good? I mean, you know, that's why I'm smiling tonight, in a pretty good mood. And how could you have a worry in the world when one of your reservoirs looks like that? As a matter of fact, it's a little fuller than that right now than you would see. But the reason we're here tonight, and the reason that we have to think about the future, is because more often or not, that's the way our storage reservoirs look. Matter of fact, that picture, believe it or not, was taken last year. So things can change rapidly, but we have to be mindful of that in the future. Matter of fact, this was the quote from February of last year from LCRA. It said, "The drought gripping the Highland Lakes is now the most severe drought the region has experienced since construction of the lakes began in the 1930s. So we often hear of the drought of record in the 1950s. By many measures, this last drought that we just went through was certainly more severe for us. Matter of fact, at the top there, you see kind of the counter I was using at this time last year. 7 years, 84 months, 2,555 days in a row of drought. That's how severe the drought was. If I was here a year ago, if you saw me, I had a big beard. It's true, big gray beard. It was my drought-busting beard. I was so desperate, I just started growing a beard, see if it would work. And well, you know, in a way it did work, but I can't take all the credit. But we have to be mindful of the way our lakes are most of the time, or many times. And these drought risks are continuing to compound. There's been a lot of studies here. As a matter of fact, you just hear recently some university studies, Texas A&M, journals. They looked at tree ring data here in Texas. They looked at even going into caves and cutting stalagmites in half and looking at thousands of years of data. And really the findings are is that Texas, Central Texas in particular, is subject to long droughts, what are called often mega droughts, droughts that last many, many decades. It doesn't mean it never rains. It just means that you're in very dry conditions for 10, 20, 30 years or more. Matter of fact, many of the studies suggest that the last 50 years in Central Texas has been significantly wetter than the historic record. So we, as adults, our memory of Texas here in Central Texas, particularly over the last 50 years, may be a wetter period than normal, and we may be just returning to a more traditional dry pattern. The other risk that we have is climate pressures are pushing down on our society, and certainly here in Central Texas. We know from working with our own climatologists that we consult with that conditions are going to get hotter. And I mean, you even see that, you know, if you just kind of read the newspaper and you see when they report average temperatures and how many days, 100, they often break it up between 2000 and now and before 2000, that you're already seeing these hotter patterns take place. If you think about what hot weather means, it means higher evaporation of the lake water. Just to put evaporation in perspective, in 2011, when we had that really mega hot year here a few years ago, right in the middle of the drought, more water evaporated off the Highland Lakes than Austin uses in a year. So that's the kind of impacts that evaporation can have. And it not only affects the lakes, it affects soils. You deplete soil moistures, you develop additional deficits that have to be filled up. So when it rains, you don't get as much runoff. So you can get in a really, really difficult condition with regards to that. So we have to be thinking about how climate change is going to be affecting us in the future too. Certainly another pressure on water is our population growth. Austin remains one of the most dynamic cities in the nation, one of the most dynamic economies, one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing, large metropolitan area. This is a simple chart of Austin Water's service population over the last 50, 80 years or so, and you can see it shows no sign of abating. I mean, I'll just put it in perspective for you. I've been utility director 9 years, and in that 9-year period, nearly 300,000 people have moved to Austin. And that's not going to stop anytime soon, and that's constant pressure on us to develop a resilient and sustainable water supply. So what are we doing to prepare for this uncertain water future that we face? One, Austin Water has assembled really a world-class series of packages that we work to sustain our water supply. We have all kinds of conservation programs. We have all kinds of programs to regulate how and when you use water. We've recently gone through, as a result of the drought, we did make our 1 day per week watering more of a permanent structure. We have all kinds of incentives and other programs for you to change your behavior. We invest hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in various educational programs. Some of you may have experienced Dowser Dan when you were in school, and Dowser Dan teaching you about water and wise water practices. All of that is flowing from Austin Water. We're investing in more resilient ways to manage water. If you see purple pipe, that's our reclaimed water system where we're taking wastewater, treated wastewater effluent, and instead of just releasing it back to the river, we're reusing that for irrigation purposes. If you golf anywhere in a municipal golf course, it's irrigated with reuse water. Here, University of Texas is converting to reuse water, cooling tanks and irrigation systems. So again, different ways about thinking about water. We send a very strong pricing signal to you. Probably most of you are Austin Water customers. As you use more water, you certainly realize that the cost of that water, once you get past kind of a certain amount, climbs very rapidly. That's an economic pricing signal that's proven to be very effective in terms of curbing our water use. Just as an example, if you go back to when this last drought started a few years ago, you say 2006, our peak water use, gallons per capita per day, if you take all the water we use, divide it by our population, that's gallons per capita per day. And from our peak to our valley, from our highest to our lowest over about the last 10 years, it's dropped 40%. So very, very good progress. I do have to say a word. Austin Water is recently recognized by an independent group, Texas Waters Project. They ranked 300 water utilities in the state of Texas and scored their conservation programs across a whole series of levels, and Austin scored #1. So very proud of the programs that we have here. But we can't stop. Given all these risks and these uncertainties of the future, we have to be thinking even broader, farther down the road, decades down the road, a century down the road. And that's what our water planning process is all about. Technically, we call it Integrated Water Resource Planning, IWRP, but for more human terms, we're describing it as water forward. Or, how are we going to be? What's the water forward? The creation of an integrated water resource plan, a long-term plan, was really an outcrop of a task force and some discussions we had in 2014 when we were really at the height of the drought. My esteemed colleague, Sharlene, was the chair of that task force, and that was one of the recommendations that they made to our utility and the council, and now we're delivering on those promises to go through and do integrated water resource planning. And it's a little different kind of planning. It's looking at water from a lot of different perspectives, not just the Austin Water perspective, but how the city uses water, city departments, how we might use water differently. So, example, how might we capture rainwater more in the future to reduce flooding and help with water supply issues? How can we continue this progress on managing water use and demand? What innovation may be coming in the future that we can anticipate, and how will that change water? So a whole host of these integrated water strategies that we're working through and starting that. And so that's what we're here today really, is to help you understand that better and maybe explain how you can participate in that and what some of the goals are, and how we shape this plan that's going to help guide us for the next century, ideally. And I think, Sharlene, that's
me.
You're up next. So,
thanks, Greg.
Okay.
So thanks. And as Greg said, we've been at this for a few years now, ever since the drought was in our midst. And I see a few people here who are also on the task force with me, including Jennifer Walker from the Sierra Club, who also served on the last task force. So it's been a few years in the making. What I want to share with you tonight is really my view of how incredibly unique and powerful and transformative our water planning process is here in the city of Austin. it is exceedingly rare that a city looks 100 years into the future and imagines what that future might be like when it comes to any resource or any aspect of our built environment. The state of Texas in our water planning process looks only 50 years into the future, and that's actually itself pretty rare, even in places in the arid American West where we've seen really deep and growing water scarcity. So 100 years into the future is unique and powerful. It is a time scale that is inherently defined by uncertainty. There are tons of unknowns, things that we will never be able to enter into this planning process, saying we have kind of a fixed set of variables or factors. We know the future we're heading into. We don't know how people will be living in 75 years, right? We don't know the climate reality that we'll be encountering within that time scale. But because we're looking that far out, we also, the flip side of those unknowns and that uncertainty is that we have an opportunity to be bold in the way that we imagine what the future might be. And when I think about the water plan that we're undertaking, this is not just a question of how do we build a more resilient water supply for the city of Austin, how do we secure water supply for the city of Austin. It is about how might we reimagine the way that we live in our built environment and the relationship that we have with water. How might we think about our water supply being something that actually transforms our urban landscape to take something that we have been in some ways perturbing, even disrupting or deadening in terms of a living landscape that water moves through, and how might we, through a water supply planning lens, actually reimagine a city that has living waters. And do it in a way that creates security and reliability and prosperity and abundance for people upstream of us and downstream all the way to the Texas coast. So Greg really, I think, already said this well. Why plan now when the drought has resolved, when the lakes are full? Well, you already heard. It's because we know the next drought is around the corner. It's not a question of if, but when. It's because water projects take decades. The types of water projects that we're thinking about in the water plan might not even just take decades. It might take an entire century to really realize the full potential of what we could do as a city. So that's why we're starting now, not in the midst of a drought. You don't start saving money when you lose your job, right? You save money when you have a job, just in case something bad happens. And you also heard from Greg, why aren't we just building more lakes, right? And that's a question that water planners across the state of Texas and the American West get. Why not just build more lakes? Well, you also heard part of the why not. It's because lakes are a huge water loser in places where you have the heat that Texas has. You know, as Greg said, in a really hot, dry year, the lakes lose as much water as the city of Austin uses. That is not a secure, resilient supply of water going forward. So what are we looking at as a task force that's looking into the next 100 years of how to provide resilient, secure water supplies? One, as Greg said, we're looking at how we make more effective use of every drop of water that comes through the Highland Lakes. We know that the Highland Lakes are going to be one of the primary water supplies of the city of Austin for as long as we can see into the future. How can we take as much of that water that comes through the Highland Lakes and make use of it not just once, but multiple times before passing it downstream to other people and other ecosystems that need that water as well? And so that's part of what the city is doing by investing in that reclaimed water line. And we can go beyond that and really tap more deeply into reuse as an opportunity for the city to create more security. We can look at alternative forms of storage. The city is looking now at not just how do we store water above ground where it evaporates and where other people have claim to that water as well, all the way up and down the watershed, but how do we make use of groundwater aquifers to store water in wet years and hold it there for the times, for when times get rough? And we've seen plenty of places in the West do this. Tucson has been storing so much water underground, they could literally not take any more surface water for like a decade, and they would still be able to function as a very arid city just by pulling the water that they have stored underground. We have less storage opportunities than places like Arizona, but we still have some around here. So that's part of what we're looking at. But where else can we get water? It turns out there is water all around us today that we regard as waste. We treat as something that needs to be moved away from us as quickly as possible, right? What happens to rainfall today in the city of Austin. Rainfall in the city of Austin today is not made use of by people in the city of Austin for the most part. The water in the Highland Lakes that we use is rainfall that falls in San Saba, in Junction, in Marble Falls, and moves into the Highland Lakes. A drop of rain that falls in the city of Austin today most likely is landing on a roof, or it's landing in a parking lot or on a street, and it is very quickly funneled off by those hard surfaces into storm drains that then might move it into an urban creek that's quickly overwhelmed by the amount of water that our urbanized environment is shedding off as fast as it possibly can. It's going into Lady Bird Lake, and then it's passing downstream into the Colorado River, where someone else or other ecosystems are making use of it. But the question is, should we be designing cities to shed water as quickly as they possibly can, and then spend money trying to find alternative supplies of water to make our water supply more resilient and secure? And that was a question that the city of Los Angeles started asking about 15 years ago. LA won the water wars of the early 20th century. They got the water throughout Southern California. They were tapping into water from the Colorado River further east. Everything looked pretty secure until some major droughts hit in the late 1900s, and the city started looking at multi-billion-dollar plans for investing in more secure water. And at the same time as that was happening, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was looking at spending multiple billions of dollars to deepen and widen the flood and storm canals throughout the city that took springtime snowpack and snow melt and pushed it out to the Pacific Ocean as fast as they possibly could. So there was more rain coming through, there was more snowpack melting faster as things got hotter. They were looking at how do we move that process along faster, and somebody looked around and said, why would we spend multiple billions of dollars on new supplies of water while we're also spending multiple billions of dollars to push the water that does come through our city out to the ocean faster and more efficiently? Why would we not look at that water not as waste or as nuisance, but as supply? And that led to a 15-year process that has culminated in an incredibly ambitious plan within that city. Within the next 20 years, they plan to reimagine the city, to reimagine its streets, its parks, its buildings, to capture as much storm water every year as the city of Austin uses water in a single year. So 50 billion gallons a year by 2035. And that is a huge plan. That's a $20 billion plan within the city of Los Angeles, right? So that's the way that really arid environments, whether it's Sydney, Australia, if it's Singapore, if it's Los Angeles, that's where arid regions of the world are looking. They're looking to local water. How do we slow water down? How do we make use of it here? How do we look at the water that we once thought of as waste as something that creates value here in our community? The reality is most water in our city is never used. That's true for the rainfall that lands in our city, some of which gets instantly contaminated as soon as it hits roadways and is just funneled out of the city. It's true for the air conditioning condensate that is produced at a scale that a commercial office building could use that water and need no potable water from the city, need no additional non-potable water from the main city lines just by capturing their AC condensate in some parts of the year. That water today goes down our sanitary sewers and is never made use of. It's true for the foundation drainage that we pump out of our city's parking garages and send down sanitary sewer drains. So there's water flowing throughout our urban environment, even created by our urban environment, that we don't use today. And that's why our water plan is an integrated water plan, looking not just at drinking water supply, but all the different ways that water moves throughout our city that we can tap into. And the good news is, in the city of Austin, we are actually looking at these options, not just in our water planning process, but in master plans. The biggest opportunity is when you have large pieces of real estate that come online and are redeveloped all at once, where you can re-engineer the city to live and breathe and treat the urban landscape as though it is alive, and to tap into that water source on site. This is an image from the master plan of the South Central Waterfront, which some of you might know as the Austin American Statesman development. It's going to be millions of square feet of real estate, and it's exactly the type of parcel where you can create economies of scale and make this cost competitive to the type of water that Greg and his team can purchase and store and treat and pump. And the image on the right is all the different types of water that they envision, those master planners envision, could be captured and used to create not just economic value, but also cultural value on site before it is then sent into Lady Bird Lake and passed on downstream to all of the human and environmental users who also need that water. So that's kind of the reality that we're looking at, the possible future that we could create. But it takes the vision of many people. It takes action not just by the water utility, but by all of the city of Austin to actually achieve that vision. And that vision of like a really living, dynamic, urban environment that creates and taps into and provides clean water downstream after using it in place to create cultural and economic value, that's something that takes 100 years. It takes 100 years to recreate a city. So that's a process that we're engaged in, and I'm just so happy to be learning with Greg and others along the way, and happy to talk more.
Well, thanks, y'all. I think let's start with that idea of 100 years. That is, as you both pointed out, an awfully long time. I'm sort of curious, do you have an idea of what it's going to look like 100 years from now? Is when you're starting to plan that far out, what are you looking at? What do you rely on to sort of produce that data? Greg, you want to start?
Well, a few things. Just as Sharlene said, you can't really, the farther out you go, the more uncertainties that you have. I mean, if you think back 100 years, think how much has changed, and could you have predicted that? But you do try to fold in several things. One, you try to anticipate how might technologies be changing. So like we've been speaking a lot about, a big part of our water planning is more of this decentralized water approach. The last 100 years of water and water utilities was really about centralized water, big assets, big plants, big reservoirs. And I think, as we're looking into the future and we think, as technology is changing, you think that, that's probably a changing dynamic where water's more captured locally. You have these multiple sources of water instead of, one giant source of water. Maybe it's a combination of sources of water. So you're making, what you want to do is you're thinking about the future is that you make decisions today in the next 5, 10, 15 years that are going to be complementary and increase kind of flexibility and resiliency for these future outcomes. So you do scenario planning and those kind of things. The other thing is looking at climate. And we are very fortunate that Dr. Catherine Hayhoe out of Texas Tech, literally one of the world's premier climatologists, is on our team. And she's going to help us with others kind of do climate scenarios. It's just how hot could it get 50 years from now, 80 years from now? What are those sensitivity range? How might that change rainfall patterns and things of that nature? So you're folding all that in. It's just kind of a little bit of the perspective on that.
Interesting. What do you think, Sharlene?
Well, I think one of the things that is really interesting that Austin Water is doing in this process is getting deep into understanding how their customers are using water today. I think for many years, it was fine for a water utility to assume, people use this amount of water inside their homes, they're probably using this amount of water outside for irrigation. We don't have to get real fine-grained about how customers are using water. But they're actually investing, I think, a lot of resources, a lot of staff capacity, I think really kind of path-breaking work to understand on a very fine-grained level how people use water. It really gets under my skin when I look at water planning processes that take today's water demand and just extrapolate it out based upon what demographers say is going to happen to population. That is the norm. That's how the state of Texas plans for water future. And it completely misses the boat on the changes that have already taken place in our economy that have led to the United States now using less water than we ever have as a country, despite our population growing. So, looking in that more fine-grained way, really understanding how water moves through the landscape is a big part of what the city's plan is, and I think it's pretty, gold star level work.
Okay.
Sharlene is making a great point because it's called a disaggregated demand model, where we're merging technologies, what we call geographic information systems, mapping data, parcel data, water use data from our billing system, and we're merging that in a little at an individual level where we can get a much finer sense of water use patterns and what's working to manage demand. And it really is cutting edge work, and all done not by consultants, by our staff, and that's what makes me most proud.
It's interesting, and I'll sort of put you on the spot here. Is there anything, do you anticipate getting anything concrete out of this? I mean, just I guess as a reporter, a former reporter, having something like, if you handed me a report that said this is what it's going to look like 100 years from now, we'd of course wonder if that, about the validity of that, but at the same time there would also be something that we could sort of hang on to, some kind of picture of what you guys are thinking the world's going to look like 100 years from now. Is there anything real quick and real concrete that you might be able to offer, or will there be something like that when the report's done?
I don't know if it's exactly going to try to forecast how it's going to be 100 years from now, but I think it'll have some scenarios and some sensitivities and some risk, and how decisions being made today are going to be complementary of those potential outcomes of the future. Sure. One of the things, if you're making investments today, water investments and changing behavior, I think is very time-consuming and expensive often, and you want to make sure that you're doing that in the way that's most complementary of potential future outcomes.
Okay. Anything to add, Sharlene?
I mean, I would hope, there's the plan that's being created, and the plan will inform choices that are made by Austin Water and the types of infrastructure that it invests in. It might even inform what other departments in the city do, in the ways that they touch and interact with water. But I would even hope that in the course of this plan, which is really just started, I mean, we've been meeting for the past year for the plan. I think maybe we have another 12 to 18 months before the consultants finally hand over the finished product. But again, that's happening during a time where you have these major parcels that are undergoing redevelopment. And I wouldn't completely take it off the table that it's possible that even as we're undertaking this exercise saying we don't know what the answer is, right? We're going to have lots of choices along the way. That image of all the different types of water that can be captured on site, that's under today's regulatory structure. That's under today's rules of what Austin Water enables. It's just not being tapped into. And so I think you could see something concrete happening in the real world that is about like how might we understand how you actually work with developers to put these types of concepts into practice, now, when those parcels are being redeveloped now, that our rules allow for it, and how do we learn from it in a way that enables the plan to be something that actually can be executed.
So thank you for that. That's an excellent segue to my next question. Imagine Austin is, of course, after all, a plan that attempts to look at the way that the city's going to develop holistically. In thinking about water and water resource planning over the next 100 years, is there something you guys would hope to add to the conversation that's going on in terms of Code Next, in terms of the way that the city thinks about land use policy moving forward? How can water use inform that discussion? You want to start with that, Sharlene?
Sure, and I know Greg's team has done a lot of thinking on this, so I'll let him be the expert on it. But Code Next has been part of our conversation recently, realizing that there's a lot of stuff that we could do as a city that will cost an awful lot of money for Austin Water. Austin Water is really trying to focus on keeping rates affordable and being financially whole. So if there's an opportunity within code to have a huge win in terms of driving down our total water usage as a city, then that can be done in a way that has no real cost to Austin Water. And that is something that we have to put into place now. And so we've had people on the task force looking at and hearing from Austin Water staff, how might that work? Is it looking at large kind of commercial facilities and the amount of acreage that they can irrigate? I'll kind of defer to Greg on that, but yeah.
Well, I think Sharlene was hitting on several. We do envision, code changes being an essential part of the future and creating opportunities for people. And Sharlene mentioned this too, to really change fundamentally how they interact with water and use water, the type of systems that are, say, more efficient, and landscaping that doesn't require water to like artificial water, to highly treated potable water, very expensive. I think in the future that's going to change significantly, and it is changing now. So we'll be shaping code and code recommendations with that. The other thing we do with the comprehensive plan is we work hand in glove with where the city's wanting to go from an urban perspective as they're looking at density issues or clusters, job clusters, and we can target water solutions for those that make sense for the future. where maybe it's, again, it might be some partial decentralization, planning better rainwater capture, seeing, again, that the development starts off in a way that's not as water intensive. I mean, I'll give you a great example, like Sharlene was talking about downtown, the Statesman Building and the urban core redevelopment. We're plumbing a lot of that area where the new central library and all the skyscrapers are going up with reclaimed water, where in the future, a lot of your non-potable uses you're using with auxiliary water supplies, either reclaimed water or rainwater. You think about toilet flushing, just for one example. There's nothing stopping you from an infinite loop, where you flush a toilet, the waste goes down, goes to the water or the treatment plant, treats it, brings it back. You flush it again, it goes to the thing. I mean, you're not taking any new water. It's kind of the same water over and over. And so that's kind of some of the things that we're trying to anticipate and work through in the future.
I may be wrong, but those don't sound like major. I mean, when I think about Code Next, I think about major political discussions and maybe some painful conversations that the community has to have. This stuff, and I could be wrong, it doesn't sound that painful. Am I wrong? Am I missing something?
Well, I don't think some of it is painful. I mean, some of it will be painful. As you think, like we've already been discussing things like should we limit how much land commercial properties can irrigate? That I mean, that might, I don't know. I mean, that might be controversial to some, like that. I mean, there's those potential kind of things that are happening. You might have more cost for development if you have multiple sources of water, auxiliary water, reclaimed water. There might be more plumbing complexities and costs for you as a developer. The fee structures, when you pay what we call capital recovery fees, connection fees, that regime is changing, has changed, will continue to change. So I think trust me, there's lots of opportunities for controversy.
I suppose we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
Sharlene, you were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what has to happen in any community, including Austin, is a conversation about trade-offs and who's carrying the burden of cost, right? The Texas legislature artificially caps how much water utilities can assess new development to recover the cost of extending service lines and building, upsizing treatment capacity and the rest of it. So anytime there's a new development that comes online, it's the ratepayers of the city of Austin who are helping to cover the cost of extending that infrastructure to that new development. I think that's a political discussion that needs to be had. Now, we might not be able to create a solution without the will of the Texas legislature that allows us to actually increase that cost, but I think it does enable us to have a real conversation about how then might we create incentives or requirements for growth to bring its own water along with it. And I think that's kind of the potential of looking at all these different types of water and how you might be able to talk about cost sharing with developers. And there are other cities that do that. San Francisco says if you have more than 250,000 square foot commercial space that's coming online, you have to provide all of your own non-potable water. You have to do that in the building itself, right? But they'll provide some cost sharing along with that. They'll help to subsidize it because they know it's a hard pill to swallow. But that's part of the transformative change that has to happen. In places like Tucson, it was probably a really hard political discussion to transform them from being a very lush kind of lawn community to one that actually had climate appropriate landscape, and yet they got through it. 20, 30 years later, the city is transformed and it's just the norm. So
from where you guys sit, to the city of Austin have the tools as it currently sits, I guess the legislative tools to be able to implement some of this stuff? Do we have what we need right now? Do we need to go to the legislature to get more of what we need? What do you think?
I think the changing water landscape, and as technologies change and some of these programs move forward, you're going to have to continue to engage stakeholders and policymakers at all levels, be it regulatory regimes, financing alternatives, connection strategies. I think that there will be, engagement. Water and Texas and the legislation are going to be, and not just for Austin, but for our host state. The future of water, the next 50 years of water, is going to be so much different than the last 50 years. It is just I've been in the water industry now well over 30 years, and it's changing so much, and it's changed so much just in the last few years. I just came back from Los Angeles, and just how that's changing, and you think about the big Colorado River and Lake Mead, and how much that's changing, and thoughts before too long, Lake Mead may not be there anymore. And what does that mean for the whole western third of the United States? So, I mean, it's just going to be profound change, and it's going to require everyone ultimately kind of reshaping laws and practices, and even groundwater in Texas. Groundwater, surface water laws are pretty well fleshed out, but groundwater is still a kind of a pretty emerging frontier for the state.
And we certainly saw that last legislative session with stuff down in I guess it was Dripping Springs. Sharlene, do you want to add anything to that?
I think we have a lot of the tools we need. I think Greg's right. No question we're going to need to have some kind of legislative innovation over time. But we, as at least a starting step, we have to make use of the rules that we have currently. We have to find a way to get people to really tap into the local water that they can already tap into. We have to get more customers onto the reclaimed water line that the city spent millions of dollars to build. So we got to work with what we have, but no question there's going to be a lot of legislative fights in the future.
Even I would add, the business model side of it. Austin Water's been going through really significant changes in our business model, but that's going to have to change. If you really think about how water utilities were cultured, it was, hey, push out as much water as you possibly can. I mean, seriously. I mean, it was just like maximize water use, and that whole mindset is changing, needs to change, and has changing for many states. Certainly, Austin's water utility. But with that, the business model has to change. I try to explain to people, it's hard for them to understand, is I'm using less water, why am I paying as much or more? And, we talk about our fixed costs, even something as simple as fire protection. It costs a whole bunch of money to provide fire protection. The big pipes, the tanks, the pumps, and that you may never use that at your house. But if your house catches on fire, or if your neighbor's house catches on fire, we have to be able to put that fire out. I mean, you know what I mean? We can't be like, well, we didn't fund it this year, but that's really difficult when water utilities are going through this change in terms of how they raise revenue. So I think that whole business model is going to continue to change, and that might require legislative issues in the future too.
And I did want to specifically ask you, from the ratepayer's perspective, what does the next 100 years look like? I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be paying water bills in 100 years, I don't think. But folks, 5-10 years down the line, are we going to see water bills rise? I mean, you guys have to exist, right? You guys have to make money to be able to pump the water, right?
I mean, water has been historically significantly underpriced, and folks have, in the United States have gotten really cultured to hardly paying anything for water. I gave some examples. You go out there in the machine and you buy a bottle of water coming out of the machine. You might pay $1 or $2. If you get that water from Austin Water, you'd probably get 2,000 gallons of water for that amount. But that's gonna have to change. I think water is going to be more expensive. I mean, I'll just give a little philosophy. And if you look at Texas over the last 50 years, now I'm not a native Texan, so I can't speak to that expertise. But just in terms of history, it has been about power. It's been about electricity and how we have enough power and whether there are challenges to that. It's more about water in the future. I just see water as the challenge for Texas, and how we manage it, the cost of it, the innovation of it. I think that's the profound challenge of the future for Texans is water. So yes, it's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more complicated. There's going to be multiple sources of it. It's going to be a much different world.
I think you guys have both sort of talked about in your remarks tonight about the general history of water in the West, and I think you probably know this better than I, that it's been somewhat fraught, and there are more than a few obstacles that you guys have to deal with. I characterize them as obstacles. I guess the first question for me should be, are these historical obstacles, say, damming of multiple rivers, the whole picture of water use in the West, how does that play locally? Does it play locally? Is this something that you have to get over to get to the next stage of water use? You want to start, Sharlene?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look about an hour and a half to our southwest, to the city of San Antonio, you see 20th century water politics playing out. And that's, the Los Angeles aqueduct from the 1920s. We take the water, we drink your milkshake, we're going to reach over and, build a 200-mile, 150-mile pipeline and take your water, right? And the reason that's being justified in the city of San Antonio to take groundwater from a community 150 miles away is because they still are operating under this paradigm that to grow we must bring on more water. to get water, the city must import water to itself, right? And that was true when William Mulholland created the Los Angeles aqueduct. It was true when farmers in Owens Valley were dynamiting it because they knew that the city would win in taking their water and they would perish, right? Their farms would perish. We don't have to play those politics. We don't have to play that import model of water security in the state of Texas or anywhere in the American West in the 21st century or the 22nd century. But that's the reality as people understand it for water. So I think what we have to do is redefine the way that a city develops water security and redefine that paradigm and redefine the expectation that people have about how we get water and what it means for our relationship to the resource and what it means for our relationship to the people who also need that water, right? We're sharing the water in the Highland Lakes, both upstream and downstream. Can we actually create a solution for the city of Austin that creates a solution for the Highland Lakes and their water security? Can we create solutions that work for Matagorda Bay, which is critically starved of freshwater inflows? You know, that's the exercise that we're on within.
I think maybe we should put Charlene's question to you, Greg. I mean, what are you optimistic? I mean, you must be optimistic. You're doing the job, right?
Am I optimistic about the future?
I guess, yeah.
Oh, well, absolutely. Yeah, I don't see anything that we can't overcome as we work collaboratively across our community. We're blessed with just plentiful, beautiful minds at Austin Water and in the city of Austin in general and in all of its citizenry. I don't see any reason why we can't work through these things. I think we are working through these things. We've been very successful. I mean, in many ways, you know, our water system was stressed like it has never been stressed through this drought, and we made it through in a way that was, you know, really, really safe and protective, and we're just going to continue to look ahead and do that. And I think Sharlene spoke well, and, you know, Mike and I've talked to you about this before. You know, I see the future of water more like baseball, and you know, that except we're going to win with what they call small ball, right? Instead of, there's not going to be a home run. We're not going to go out and build some new Lake Travis, you know, and a smash home run, you know, that everyone, it's going to be bunts and singles and maybe a strikeout once in a while, but, you know, we're going to win the game through a combination of small hits, not some trying to do some mega home run, and you know, I think in the end that's probably a more resilient future anyways.
Sure. I'm struck sort of by the description that you're giving of water systems of the future and comparing them to distributed solar energy. It seems like there's a similarity there. Is that accurate? Is that?
Yeah, I think it is a good parallel. That, you know, what the electric utilities are going through with rooftop solar and maybe stored energy and how it's kind of remaking their whole approach to things and creating, you know, both opportunities and complications. I think water's going to face a similar considerations.
Do you think we'll see similar technology, I guess, improvements or whatever? Is there an analog to the home solar power cell in the water world? Charlene, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, if you go, next time you're in San Francisco, go to the San Francisco Public Utility Commission building, which is a public building you can get in. You can probably even sign up for a tour of what they call a living machine, which is, you know, within the basement, it treats all of the wastewater from the building. And it runs that wastewater after it goes through a few kind of processes within the basement. The wastewater comes up to the sidewalk and it flows out through these constructed wetlands and planters that run down the sidewalk. And then it runs from there into the cafeteria where everybody has their lunch. And then it goes back down into the basement and it gets hit with UV as a final step before it gets sent back up into the toilets, right? I mean, that's really disruptive technology, but it's disruptive business model stuff as well, right? I mean, how, as a water utility, do you enable that type of treatment technology to be happening across your city? How do you transform your kind of regulatory structures? How do you do what San Francisco is doing, where they're allowing adjacent buildings to sell water between each other? You know, water utilities have been monopolies for forever. I think we might see that change now. That may or may not change in the city of Austin, but it's already changing in the city of San Francisco. So, you know, we're seeing, I think that the distributed solar analogy is exactly on point. And I think it's overlooked and neglected by a lot of people within the water space, and it's perilous to do it because we saw what happened to electric utilities by ignoring that potential.
I would add a couple of thoughts to that. Well, another way we're very much like power. You think about the smart grid. You have digital water meters. You can maybe get data on how much electricity you're using moment to moment. Many water utilities are not like that now. You have to wait a month to find out how much water you used, or if you had a leak, or if your irrigation system was running crazy. That's certainly one of the things that is going to change, and Austin Water's planning for that change, where we're going to switch to more of a digital meter system, what we call advanced meter infrastructure, and really profound changes there. Although I want to caution that water is different than electricity in many ways. It's physical, it's heavy, you drink it, you make food with it. It is much more personal and connected to your health. Water, the water industry and the water business really grew out of public health. If you say 100 years ago or more, in many countries still today, the thing that's most likely to kill you is water. We don't think about that in the United States. We don't think about that at all. And we have to be mindful of how we manage this transition. I mean, I'll give the electrical. If you have solar panels and electricity is mixing with electricity coming out of the plants, it's all the same in a way. It's electricity. Mm-hmm. But water, if you mix water supplies and something happens and you accidentally get reclaimed water going into your drinking water, and you're giving it to your baby, you're going to be pretty upset about that. And so, with the water utilities, we have to be, mindful of those things and make sure that we manage this transition in a way that doesn't create a big setback for us.
The stuff that Sharlene's talking about, the San Francisco model, the very, it sounds very advanced. Are you guys actively thinking about that sort of advancement? Are you guys, is that something you I guess I'm sort of trying to picture you guys in the building, sort of trying to plan out what the future looks like. Is this the sort of stuff you consider when you're thinking about future rates, future planning? I mean, is this part of active discussion at Austin Water?
Yes, it's a part of this water planning process. There's a significant part of it is a decentralized kind of component as we think about this for the future. So yes, that's an active part of that. Austin Water is also preparing itself for that future. We have a team that's working and thinking about decentralized applications and how it would work. We had kind of a theoretical test of that. We had one of our new downtime skyscrapers had talked about potentially wanting to do a decentralized application. Mm-hmm. It just kind of didn't come together, and there's some regulatory challenges to that, not just at our level, but at the state level. Mm-hmm. But those things are inbound, and we're going to have to kind of puzzle through that. Again, it's kind of a scale thing. I think you begin to work through these things, you understand them, you build expertise. It's one thing to do a handful of them. It's another thing to try to do it by the tens of thousands. And I don't know quite how that future's all going to work.
Sure. I want to sort of switch gears and talk a little bit about what happens after you guys produce the product, the report, the study. I think the big thing that has to happen, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is you have to sort of get in touch with policymakers, right? You got to get the policymakers to buy into what you're doing, and in this, be real about the current climate in the city of Austin. You've heard criticism from at least one City of Austin council member specifically about the I'm gonna blank on her name, but the professor you mentioned earlier,
Dr. Catherine Hayhoe.
Yes, and I wonder how that of course that came from one council member, and the council is 11 people, so it's one concern. But I'm just sort of wondering, how are you guys preparing to make that political sort of pitch? I mean, that's not necessarily the water utilities role. Is it your role, Sharlene? What does that look like?
I think it's certainly the role of task force members going forward to help educate our council members about why the water utility is looking at particular types of futures and what that will mean in terms of political decisions that will have to happen within the city. I think the reason that the water utility is undertaking this public stakeholder outreach process is, one, yes, to be inclusive and transparent and representative. But I think the most important piece of that is, how can you, through the planning process, be able to create will and desire among lots of different people within the population to see how the water plan benefits them, right? It's not just about drinking water or turning on the tap and having your washing machine have adequate water supply. This is about what expectations do you have of how the lakes that you have used, not just Lake Travis and Lake Austin, Lady Bird Lake, But Decker Lake, for the east side, you have people who have not typically been involved in water planning processes. They're certainly not in this room, who've been fishing and swimming in Decker Lake for years and years. When we talk about the possibility of lowering that lake by 25 feet to be able to store reclaimed water in it, the response is, why are you shunting that off onto the east side, right? Why are you not lowering water levels in Lake Austin just because it's surrounded by $1 million homes, right? That's a legitimate question. That's what has to happen through the course of the planning process, and through that you have to help people not understand not just how do they defend their own turf or their own values, but how do we create value through the water plan for those communities in the future that they want to see. You know, in the city of Los Angeles, that stormwater plan is not just about ripping up alleyways and making them green alleyways that allow water to infiltrate. It's about how do we design park spaces to store water? How do we design ball fields that have water stored within them, right? And how do you then use that as a way of creating more revenue and more funding for urban parks, for communities that don't have access to green space? How do you take some of those, concrete channels that are just funneling water through the city and are just the face of urban blight and recreate it to be a wetland that actually creates value to an urban population that doesn't have access to that, right? That's the way that we have to be talking about what the water plan is to create the political will, because you're right, you can have a perfect plan, and if the whole conversation when you go to council is about, well, we're not raising rates and we don't believe in climate change and this only benefits people in the West, and you really haven't accomplished anything other than having a great plan that's technically robust.
Greg, I think a moment ago I answered the question for you. I should let you answer the question. What do you see your role in that sort of after the plan is completed, after I guess you said 2017, when you guys are ready to release? What is your role after that point?
Well, to educate policymakers, to go over the process, and to ultimately implement the plan is what we would want to do. Now, it isn't the kind of plan that you implement in one day or 1 year or even 10 or 20 years. It's the kind of plan that helps guide your decision, and you're updating this plan in the future. It becomes kind of the nucleus of your water planning in the future. Sharlene said it well. I think what we're attempting with this planning process is, one, we have a citizen advisory group that's helping to guide and shape it, and that group has been appointed by the current council. There's 11 members on this task force, and so every council member is representative. And I don't want to speak for the task force, Sharlene, but I think it's working really well. I think it's a highly collaborative and engaged process, and the staff and the task force are working well. It's going to have a really rich community outreach process that's underway now and is going to continue through all kinds of forums, not only like these kind of forums, but various ways that people are participating electronically. We have a website. If you want to see any task force meeting, you go to our website, you see all the content, the material. We're going to be engaging the community, I think, in ways that we never have before. We're working closely with each council district to make sure we're tapping involvement with folks that maybe aren't as involved or disenfranchised in the past. It's very easy to get environmental activists involved in water planning. That isn't a problem for me. But how we reach out to others is important. I think we're really going to pioneer some new ways that we're doing that. So in the end, I think it's a community plan that the community owns, and that helps policymakers and others become comfortable with how we move that forward. There's going to be a debate and even conflict about it, but we're good at that. We're ready for that. I'm hardened up, Mike.
I've seen it. Sharlene, I think we should put Greg's question to you. How's it going with the task force? What's the debate been like? What's the conversation been like? What are you hearing from your colleagues?
Yeah, I think the last task force was I think a little bit harder to manage. There was a lot of cultural clashes, maybe. I think there was a lot of kind of memory of maybe some different relationships with water utility. But I think that through that process, I think that was a robust process as well. And I think the water utility was very collaborative in it, and it led to some great recommendations for how we can be more drought resilient, right? This task force is about really a long-term plan. How are we really investing in water security in a way that is ethical, that's representative? And that process, I agree with Greg, has been about as good as I could possibly have hoped for in any community. I've seen Austin Water take on incredibly complex and challenging planning methodology. Like, this is not normal. It's not normal to look at 100 years. It's not normal to incorporate climate change. It's not normal to look at decentralized options, especially when you're looking at a business model that really has been wedded to a centralized option, and where we know that even if we were just keeping the system that we already have today in place, that's going to take a lot of money to keep that system, robust and functioning. If you're looking at diversifying your water supply, that's going to cost money. It inherently will cost money. And being able to do that in a way that looks beyond just kind of the centralized model that the urban utility has always operated within, I think takes a lot of chutzpah, and I think represents the real inclusiveness and listening that the water utility has participated in, and a lot of real hard work from people who are not just in the water domain. Diane Kennedy from the real estate sector has been, and who's here tonight, has been part of it. I think we have a pretty good cross-section of people. We need a lot more from that community engagement piece to be really kind of racially representative and economically representative of our city. But I mean, I'm really proud of Austin Water staff and the task force members, and I think we're doing awesome, hard work.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more from me, and then we'll go to your questions. I'm sort of curious about, we talked a little bit about it, but I want to sort of get a more direct answer from you guys. Are there state laws that are going to have to change to make all this stuff work? What do you think, Greg?
Yes, and as we think about the future, some of these different ways of thinking about water, there'll be state laws that will have to change and be updated.
Which ones?
Mike, I don't have them kind of itemized now. I think some of the regulatory side of things, particularly as we move into a more decentralized arena in the future, and again, these are many, many years of work. I think some of that's probably going to have to change and be updated, and has been changing over the years. I mean, some of those kind of things, potentially some of the ways we finance or pay for connection fees, just a few of those kind of things.
Anything to add, Charlene?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether or not it's statute or just informing the way that we actually undertake water planning in the state of Texas, we have got to change the norm of water supply projects being water supply projects, flooding projects being flooding projects, water quality projects being their own sort of thing. Every project that interfaces with water, and I'm including transportation projects, building roads, building parks, those are all water projects. So we have to start breaking down those walls, and I think the city of Austin can be really transformational within the state of agitating for a truly integrated way of planning water and financing water.
Okay. I'll give since you're pressing me, I'll give you an example.
I appreciate it.
So, and again, there's a lot of work to do, and we're not like just ready to press the go button and all of this, but we were working through one of these examples of a significant decentralization. If you had a drinking water plant building size in the basement of a skyscraper, okay, so it's making drinking water in the basement of the skyscraper and distributing it to that skyscraper to not only use to like flush toilets, but to drink. Okay.
So this is like the next step beyond what you're talking about in San Francisco, Charlene.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So we had a suggestion. We were working with the client. That was kind of how they started off. Is what if we did that?
Wow.
And so we were like, it freaks us out a little bit too. I mean, to be honest with you, again, like I talked, it's like, like safety, public safety, how's this all work?
Yeah.
So as we were investigating this, and some of the staff was looking at this, and one of the things came up that skyscraper would be its own drinking water utility. And they have to go to the state of Texas and get a drinking water utility license.
Wow.
And we'd have to release them from our CCN,
Wow.
our service territory. And then it led to questions like, well, who's going to run that plant? And is it going to be Austin Water staff, or is it going to be the skyscraper owner staff? And the skyscraper owner's like, well, I don't want to run a plant in my basement. And then like, well, who's going to replace the plant when it breaks? And how are you going to get in there? And and can the plant provide fire protection? No, it's just for the skyscraper. Well, who's going to provide fire protection?
Wow.
Well, you are. Well, how are you going to pay for that? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's like,
Wow.
Can you see how this like goes from like, woo, like that? So as we envision this future, we got to figure all this out.
Yeah.
So there's your example.
That's a crazy example. Thank you so much for it. Are there questions, folks? I think they're coming down now. Thanks so much. And for those of you that haven't gotten a chance, I think there's some note cards floating around if you want to ask a question. Let's see. So about the Highland Lakes. Highland Lakes are Austin's main source of water and will continue to be well into the future, stipulated here. It is a shared resource, and our neighbors can help use it efficiently as well. How is Austin helping to make that happen?
Want me to think?
Sure.
Okay, first, the statement is right on. And Sharlene said this in the introduction. The Highland Lakes and the Colorado River system that runs right through our city is going to be the heart of our water supply for the foreseeable, into the 100-year picture. And so how do we kind of manage that water supply in a way that's beneficial for the whole region, and what does Austin Water do in that? One, through this drought, probably the biggest change that this drought incurred is a remaking of the whole way the Highland Lake water is allocated across the basin, particularly for downstream rice farmers. Mm-hmm. What they call the water management plan that was in place by El Sherry was really set up to give almost unlimited water to downstream rice farmers for very small amounts of money. And nothing against rice farmers and crops and growing, obviously we all need food, but that was really an outdated regime, and that has changed profoundly. The whole water management plan has been remade. It has dials in it now that start to assess risk earlier, start to curtail downstream rice farm water earlier as we're experiencing drought conditions, and is a much more adapted water management plan. Mm-hmm. We've also worked to protect the environmental flows downstream. Austin Water cares very deeply about the health of the basin estuaries in Matagorda Bay, and I think we worked really hard to protect that. We're a leader in terms of motivating others to change in Central Texas. 7 years ago, we were the first to go to 2-day per week watering, and every other community ultimately followed. Now we've set a standard. After the drought, we're going to stay at 1 day per week watering. We're demonstrating that our tree canopy can remain healthy under 1 day per week watering, that people's landscaping can be adapted, that there's more efficient ways to water, and I think ultimately we're going to pull others into the future. This water plan is going to be, I like what, chutzpah, we're doing, we're trying to be, and that's going to, I think, carry forward others to kind of have Austin be the first to step out there. So a few thoughts about that.
Interesting. Charlene?
Yeah, I think I would love to see the City of Austin and Austin Water Utility really embrace, and I think they are. I think they're waiting to kind of earn their laurels until we've gotten through this water planning process. But once we've done that, I would love to see them really embrace and champion their role as leaders throughout this region and across the watershed, and to find champions in local government and regional government who can help to be those champions as well, to create really transformative, cooperative ways of creating a healthy watershed that provides reliable water to a robust economy. And that's something that, again, isn't just the technical planning process, and it's part inspiration, but I think it's also political leadership and engagement. And you've seen that in places throughout the West where you have these, water buffalo kind of in locked, horns and water fights that have been just paralyzing people for, almost 100 years, where it takes political leadership to create a different transformative reality. I have no idea what the answer is going to be in our water plan. None of us have any idea what the answer is going to be. But there's a possibility that to create that transformative change and to unlock that future, it takes cooperation of users up and down the basin, and maybe even cost share. I don't know what the answer is here, but if you can see cities in the West cost sharing, it was unfathomable 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that the city of Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Denver would go in together and fund a conservation effort to fund on-farm conservation in the Colorado River. No one would have ever thought that was possible, right? These entities were basically at war. It was a zero-sum game. That's changing because of what Greg said about Lake Mead being at a point where Hoover Dam might not be able to produce energy within the next 5 years. That's how critical that situation is there. So hopefully we're not going to have that critical of a drought situation. I'd love for it to be led by inspiration of Austin Water Utility, but it's going to take inspiration and real political leadership to get the basin to where it needs to go.
And it's funny, we have a sort of a follow-up question embedded in here, and I think I'll read this and then maybe add something to it. Will there be any regional input or consideration in formulating the plan? And I think I'd add to that, are you guys planning specific types of engagement for your regional partners? I mean, there's leadership, and then there's also making sure that everybody feels like they're included, right? I'll ask you, what do you think, Greg?
Yes, although in a qualified way. We are going to reach out. We do have regular dialogues with our surrounding communities and neighbors. And obviously, as I mentioned, Austin Water serves some surrounding communities and municipal utility districts already. So just by being a part of our system, they'll influence this. So that'll be a part of the process. Certainly, we have the Highland Lakes in common. Many of the surrounding communities, particularly to the north, are Highland Lake communities, and we work very collaboratively in terms of how we engage with them and LCRA. We have a long partnership. As a matter of fact, we have a contract that requires LCRA and Austin to meet every quarter and talk and plan, and we're keeping them up to date on our water planning process, conservation programs, demands, all those things. So yes, that's an element of this. But it's not gotten to the point, and I think it's probably post some of this water plan as we're implementing how we kind of have some complementary strategies. We're not envisioning like some kind of regional water supply or as like Sharlene was saying, where there's going to be some mega water project that we're all trying to do to move water about the state of Texas. That's not kind of our vision for this plan. Matter of fact, one of our core guiding principles is local water. We're really trying to focus this on local water. So,
decentralized.
Yeah, so in a way, it is kind of it's not really like a 5-county area kind of plan.
If I could, it strikes me, it seems like a very different water utility when that happens. Is that inaccurate?
No, I think, it is transformative in the end. It will take a long time, and you're not sure how the story ends, but like I said, I think the next 50 years of water is much different than the past 50 years.
Interesting. This is a wonderfully wonky question, so I'm going to ask it. You mentioned that average per capita water use in Austin has dropped about 40% in the last 10 years or so. Now that the area lakes are full, what level of rebound in per capita use are you seeing, and do you expect to see? What conservation levels do you think are sustainable, and what will drive additional water conservation?
Well, a few thoughts there. When the drop was from our peak in 06, our per capita was like 190 gallons per capita per day. That's all water, not just residential water, but all water for every purpose, including leaks, divided by our population. Last year's per capita was about in the low 120s. I don't remember the exact number, but like 122 or something like that. We're not anticipating, and we're taking steps that we don't see a mega rebound in per capita. We don't envision going anywhere near, 190 is like no way, but even, our goal was 140. Our 10-year goal was 140. We wanted to get to 140 by 2020. Well, we're at 120 by 2015 or 2016. So, we're working to sustain those improvements, to consolidate those games. It was one of the big drivers why we didn't recommend going back to 2-day-per-week watering, that we had been in 1-day-per-week watering for over 4 years, and it had become the new norm. Why don't we just keep that? I just looked today. Our per gallon capita this fiscal year is 118 as we stand today.
Wow.
Now, it'll creep up a little bit as we finish off August in September, but it's going to end about where we were, in the low 120s. I'm very proud of that, and it's been a very hot, dry summer, and so no, I don't see it climbing back up. Matter of fact, one of our goals is that it continues to go down. One of the things we're I think very proud of and worked very hard to obtain is, even though Austin's population has been growing so dynamically, if you look at the total amount of water we used, say last year, roughly 140,000 acre feet, you have to go back, well over a decade to find another year. I think it maybe even the 1990s where we used less water. So even though our population has expanded so rapidly, through these various techniques, we've been able to serve that population with total less water. Not only gallons per capita a day lower, but total less water. And that's the trend we want to stay on.
Is there a sort of a downward glide path that's too steep? Could you guys conserve too much, I guess is the question.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, in the sense you wouldn't want to do it in a way that creates hardships. So, for example, too hard a hardship. So, example, we wouldn't want to get, like, one of our big worries in the drought was we didn't want to lose the tree canopy. One of our big concerns is if the Highland Lakes had continued to fall, because, they got to a 30% full at the worst part. If they had fallen much farther, if they had gone into 25% to 20%, we probably would have been in all outdoor watering cut off. and that would endanger the tree canopy. That's irreplaceable. And so we would never want to do something of that nature where the tree canopy would be endangered or public health would be endangered. So I suppose there is too steep a curve, but I think the way this will work, it'll be a glide path that we'll be able to very gracefully work through with that. But it involves changes, as I keep mentioning. It involves changes to your business model too. And Sharlene, you may have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this might be anathema to some people. I would say too steep of a curve would be creating too much financial distress to the water utility, right? I mean, we could, if we wanted to aim at getting to where San Francisco is today, which is something like 40 or 50 gallons per capita, that's a much more dense urban environment, very little outdoor watering, totally different scenario than what we have here. But say you were to set a target like that and try to get there pretty quickly, I mean, that imperils Austin Water from being able to actually execute the capital programs that will be needed to do this plan, right? I also think, there's conservation for conservation's sake. If we're not delivering more water downstream to ecosystems that need it, and we're just storing more water in the Highland Lakes where it's evaporating, what's the point, in my mind, of conservation? If we're getting to a point where we have an aggressive conservation goal and it's because we're trying to bank as much water as we can in an aquifer storage and recovery field, great, awesome, let's do it, right? But there has to be a reason to conserve the water, and it can't just be a numerical goal.
Okay. Speaking of capital improvement plans, another question from the audience. To what degree will the plan, when complete, inform the city's capital improvement plan in the next 5 or 10 years? Greg?
Well, it's one of the reasons we're doing it is so we can guide capital investments on the water supply side, and it's already guiding the plan. We're in kind of feasibility work on some recommendations that had come out of the previous task force. Sharlene keeps mentioning aquifer storage and recovery, and we do see that as a very attractive technology for us, where we take water, say Highland Lake water during times of plenty, like now, and we store it underground, create a bubble of water, maybe create a strategic reserve of a year's water supply, and it's safe and sound, it never evaporates, it's drinking water quality, and it may stay down there for years or decades. And then when you're in a very severe drought and you need that water to help get through the drought, it's there for you to use. So those technologies are already starting to be embedded in our capital program. I mentioned meter technologies. That's in our 5 and 10-year CIP planning now. Reclaimed water projects are a part of our CIP. We're working with the state of Texas to borrow money from their SWIFT loan program, which reduces our overall financing for technologies like meters and reclaimed water. So it's already guiding our CIP planning as we look out 5, 10, 20 years, and I think will continue as we get more details of the plan. Some of the things won't be capital at all. Like there'll be, behavioral changes, code changes. Some of it may be in other city departments. Austin Energy, Watershed, as they're changing and adapting to the way they're using water and recapturing it. So,
Okay. Anything to add, Sharlene?
I think that was a great answer. I mean, I would say, a big part of what we're looking at is stormwater and rainwater capture on site and other things that kind of have been for a while within the realm of watershed protection, which has a very small capital budget and is really challenged to do like flood protection projects and stuff like that they have to do. I would love for us to get to a point within this city and maybe through this water planning process where something is happening like what we're seeing in the city in DC, which has been dealing with stormwater issues for years. The reason they care about it is that they are constantly overflowing their sewage treatment plants into the Anacostia River and the Potomac River, and they are being fined by the EPA. So now if you're doing a new large development in DC, you have to pay into a fund. You can either offset stormwater on site for the first 1 to 2 inches, or if that's not cost effective or you just don't want to do it as a developer, you pay into a centralized fund that the city operates that then goes toward creating green spaces that can keep water on site to keep sewage out of the rivers. Now that's being done along with a multi-billion-dollar deep tunnel plan. So it's capital projects alongside these financial incentives. And I think that's something the city of Austin could be doing, but it's not going to be just Austin Water Utility, right? It can have a water supply benefit, The first step was asking, which nobody had asked before until the last task force or the beginning of this one, if you're keeping water on site for water quality and flood control reasons, what's the yield? What's the supply benefit of that? Well, I don't know. We've never calculated the supply benefit, right? It wasn't a supply issue. It was a water quality issue. So, I mean, we got to think beyond just Austin Water's CIP. Think big. Think transformative.
Okay. How will industry stakeholder groups be involved? And I apologize, hand raised a little rough here. I'm sorry, and reached out to, looking for public outreach in some kind of way. Are they going to be involved in the plan? How's that going to work?
What was the first part of it?
Industry groups, industry stakeholder groups, say, and I'm not sure. I'm going to guess development groups, any sort of folks. I imagine that there's some interest in. This may not be what was meant, but Samsung has a plant that uses a ton of water. How are those folks going to be involved in the planning process and for the 100-year plan?
You want to take that one first?
Yeah. Well, I think we have some representation of it on the task force, right? We're pretty diverse. It's not just environmental activists, thankfully. We have another number of people from real estate who are participating, and hopefully will help to create inroads to that community to engage them up front. I don't know, Greg, if you want to talk at all about kind of your high-tech industry customers. I mean, those are some of the entities that are most used. They're operating in places like Phoenix. They're doing really advanced treatment technologies and on-site kind of stuff in those contexts. They're no stranger to it, right? I think that's a group that would be very worthwhile reaching out to early on to understand what they're willing to do. But
Sharlene hit on some of it. One, in terms of like various community groups and industrial groups or apartment complex association, our outreach programs are going to target them through a whole lot of ways. One, community involvement. We're going to have surveys. We have a gargantuan email server that we have, a lot of contacts. We routinely are engaged with these groups at a lot of different levels. I have a very strong public information group, and so we'll be working, with all these folks to get input on the plan through various means. In terms of some of our actual large industrial customers, we are routinely engaged with them on water supply issues, on their water use, on wastewater issues, be it Samsung, University of Texas, and we meet with the University of Texas every quarter as they're planning campus expansions, the new hospital complex, making sure that it's ready for a water future that we see, in terms of like reclaimed and those kind of things. So I think through big ways and small, we'll be trying to wrap as much of those people as we can into this.
I think the questioner here is looking for some sort of specific. Is there going to be a metric like? Would you try to reach out to them 3 to 5 times, 5 to 10 times? Like, is that part of the set of goals that you guys are working with, or?
Well, it's a great question. My understanding is that the CDM Smith, the contractor who is working on this, is bringing part of that public engagement, and I'm not sure that those metrics have yet been articulated through this process.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
I am hoping that they will be, and it's a very fair and good question.
Okay. What kind of green infrastructure programs can we implement now to start saving and storing water? Are there incentives for installing rain barrels? I believe there are. Are there?
Yes, we have incentives for various rainwater capture systems, and the incentive can grow with the size of the system. I'm not an expert of all of our incentive programs for that, so I'd probably refer you to some staff or our website. We have other incentive programs if you have replaced turf grass, and we do some of those kind of things. We also have incentive programs. I wouldn't call them incentive programs, but we've already made code changes where we're working to make sure that, say, you're directing rainwater flow to irrigate parking lot islands with rainwater instead of just having it go into the sewer system like Sharlene was describing. So, that's green infrastructure. It's not incentive-based per se, but it's kind of new development-based. Our whole reclaimed water system is incentivized because it's below cost. If you hook up to reclaimed water, if you're an existing customer, you convert off potable to reclaim, you can reduce your costs per 1,000 gallons of water because we keep that cost lower as an incentive for you to hook up. So, our whole reclaimed water system is based on kind of an incentive-based model. So just a few examples of what we have.
Okay. Sharlene, would you like to see any more added to that? Are there good ways of sort of expanding the way that we can conserve through incentive programs that maybe you'd like to see the utility add?
Yeah, I mean, I would really like to see this effort focus on large commercial scale, like large parcel opportunities. When you have redevelopment or you have a big industrial client who's coming in where you can really get big water savings, I would love to see us identify other opportunities that we could undertake, either Austin Water Utility or watershed protection through that process. I mean, I think when you look at the economics of localized water, it's the bigger the parcel you can get, the more you're really getting at cost parity to what the water utility can provide. And that's where we have to be focusing. It's great to do kind of small scale rainwater barrel kind of stuff. It's a good kind of starter to the whole thing, but we have to be thinking at a larger scale. How do you transform a city? You do that as the city is growing and as it's changing, as it's evolving. That's where the hotspot is.
Okay.
And I would add, just in terms of incentives, since you came up, some incentives like run their course. Like we used to have incentives where we would pay you to switch to a high efficiency washer. But that was, when high efficiency washers were new to the market, they were much more expensive. You had a choice between regular washers and high efficiency washers. But as the industry changes, and as now, you go into Lowe's or wherever, all you see is high efficiency washers. Why should we pay you to buy what the market's already adapted to? So some of those kind of incentives get phased out and new ones come in.
Sure.
So it's an evolving kind of thing.
Sure, and you guys, I imagine, are constantly evaluating what...
Yes, and we want to be wise with ratepayer dollars, because in the end, incentives are, you guys are paying for the incentives. So, we want to get as much value out of those that we can. Like one example, we used to have our own rain barrels. And, it was very expensive for us to buy rain barrels and try to store them, and people come and pick them up, and we had staff trying to hand them out. We're like, Lowe's and Home Depot have rain barrels. It doesn't make sense for us to be in the rain barrel business. And so, some of those things, kind of run their course.
Gotcha. What are the biggest challenges to retrofitting older, established, perhaps residential neighborhoods in Austin with a purple reclaimed water system? And with these challenges, is it feasible to implement these systems in the immediate future?
We have not targeted residential applications with reclaimed water as of yet. We've been targeting big water users, University of Texas, municipal golf courses, parks, industrial users, industrial laundromats, things like that, where we get a lot of mileage in terms of water use reductions. We have not brought it into residential neighborhoods. It is a challenge, particularly in existing residential neighborhoods, to convert them because their plumbing systems aren't set up for reclaimed water and they're not separate. There's a lot of cost. There's backflow prevention considerations. Like I explained earlier, it can never happen, or you have to really protect that you don't get some kind of backflow where reclaimed water or maybe what we call gray water, wash water, shower water, that you're recapturing it and you're putting under pressure and you think you're pumping it out into your backyard for irrigating your grass, but you're actually pumping it into your faucet or you're pumping it out into the public water supply. So there's some risk in terms of that. So I think in the future, some of that can happen, yes. That'll be things that we'll work through. But right now, we don't have any programs like that to go. Again, you're balancing this risk-reward. Do you plumb a neighborhood for reclaimed water at a pretty high expense? Individual customer, even a high water user is only using a few thousand gallons of irrigation water a month. That might not be the best way to invest in reclaimed right now. Maybe it's in some other ways.
What do you think, Sharlene?
Yeah, retrofits are tough. The cost of water is going to have to be way higher for retrofits to be economically competitive and justifiable as an investment. Where the real opportunity is new build, new development. If you have an existing reclaimed water line from the city of Austin that's going past a greenfield site where there's going to be a big new subdivision, I don't see any reason why that there shouldn't be an expectation or a requirement that any irrigation for that community be reclaimed water. And that's true for the commercial sector as well. But the problem here is that we have the reclaimed water line that we have, right, which has been expensive to put into place. It's been important to do. But every time you're looking at adding linear feet of that system, into the urban metropolitan area, you're looking at a very significant cost. That's the reason why we're looking at completing the core, looking at how you invest in the centralized component of that system. And we should be doing everything we can to get more entities onto that system where it's going to be built out in the core. But if I looked last year, for commercial real estate, we had millions of square feet that were being added on, nowhere near that reclaimed water line, or where it's projected to go anytime in the future. It's happening in the northwest and southwest, very, very far from where that existing infrastructure is. And so, what I would really like to see us talking about and looking at is how do we amplify or accelerate those decentralized options that could create opportunities for reuse out in the areas where we don't have a reclaimed water system and we're not likely to have one, but where we're adding more people. Retrofits don't make sense for us. They're not going to make sense for a long time. We hope that the cost of water never gets so high that retrofits become economically effective. So we have to look at what do we do with new build, what do we do with redevelopment where it's happening.
Just a few amplifications on that. Just so everyone knows, like our main reclaim system from our wastewater plants is growing out from the wastewater plants. So, it's not like all over the city, nor will it ever be. It's kind of targeted. The other thing, and Sharlene made some good points, we have, and it might have been a recommendation of the last task force, I can't remember, but we have code in place now that if you are redeveloping your site or you have a new site and you're within a certain distance of a reclaimed water line, you must hook up to that reclaimed water line. That you can't choose to not do that, or that you must convert certain aspects of your water to reclaimed water. So we are starting to kind of try to leverage some of the investments that we've made.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more question and sort of looking ahead. Will water continue to be a public utility, or with this decentralization, will it be more private?
You want to go first?
Oh, this is the existential question, right?
Yeah.
I think it's to be determined, and I'm not answering that from the perspective of Austin Water. I'm saying, like, if you look at the sector as a whole, it's TBD. My hope is that public utilities will continue to play the role that they have in protecting public health. My hope is that they'll do that in a way that creates opportunities that are controlled and safe for private entities that are bringing private capital that can take the burden of that infrastructure development off the backs of ratepayers and internalize it into development and do it in a way that's controlled and safe. And we're seeing that happen in other places in the United States, where it's not necessarily the potable water supply. We might never get to a point where we want potable water to be handed off to somebody that's not the public system that's responsible through the political process. But I see no reason to artificially remove private capital and private entities from coming in and helping us to develop non-potable resources.
Okay. What do you think, Greg?
Well, I'm pretty biased towards the public model, and I'm proud of the public model and the public water utility, and I think Sharlene hit on some of it too. I think the public water utility is the best position to make the best decisions for society as a whole, and it isn't going to drift itself into optimizing only for cost or revenues. I think with policymakers that are accountable to the elected to the public for the elected officials, that's a great model, and we shouldn't let go of that without really thinking it through. I do think there's probably going to be a mixture of some of this public-private partnerships and some potential for additional ways of that happening. Although I worry, Mike, I really do worry. I worry sometimes that companies will come in and exploit kind of seams in the public water utility model. Like, hey, I could go to. I'm just going to make something up.
Please.
But a water utility, a private water utility would come in, or some private thing, and go to Samsung and and say, hey, I can configure a water system for you where you get off Austin Water and you pay us instead, and it'll reduce your costs, and then they get off our water utility. And so these really lucrative parts of the system are spun off, and then the public system is left with the big expensive things of it, the legacy system, the fire protection costs, it's like I would hate to see like that kind of model happen, where there's kind of even social equity concerns with that to me. It's kind of philosophical, I know, but I do worry about it. I think, we have to manage that transition in a way that is good for all and not kind of have it be exploited.
It sounds like in that scenario, the public utility would sort of be stuck with all the stuff that the capital doesn't want, and that might make it extremely difficult, I think, just to underscore what you're saying, for you guys to do your job.
Yes, and my example with Samsung was just made up, fictitious.
Sure. Yeah,
I was not like singling them out in any way, but it's just an example. Or even worse yet, I mean, like sometimes what's happened is people come in and they have an idea and they build something and it's going really good, but then after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the infrastructure wears out and they walk away. And who picks up the pieces? The public utilities. I mean, I can give you a lot of examples of when that's happened. And, some of the MUDs, it's like the slap together a MUD, minimize the infrastructure, great things are happening. Oh, it's 20 years later. Well, it's all broken and not working anymore, so pick it up, Austin Water. We have to be mindful. We don't want those kind of things to happen.
Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Again, thank you all. Let's give our panel, Greg and Sharlene, and our moderator, Mike, another round of applause, please. And thank you all for your great questions. They were amazing. We do want to hear from you. Please connect with us by email, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media. Come to our public workshops. We are going to be holding those throughout this process. Again, this process is going on until at least the late 2017. We're going to have our first public workshop on September 7th. We're still working out the logistics, but that will be on our website, and we'll get that out to you. But again, thank you for your interest in Water Forward and Austin's water future, and we hope that you will spread the word and also connect with us so we can get your input. Thanks, and have a good evening.